Bear and Roly Poly, written by Elizabeth Winthrop, illustrated by Patience Brewster. One day, Nora said to Bear, "I'm going over to Grandma's house. She is giving us a present." "Goody, goody, goody," said Bear. "What is it?" "A new baby sister," said Nora. "A baby sister," Bear cried. "Yes," said Nora. She gave Bear a big fat hug and an extra squeeze. "Here comes Mrs. Duck. She'll take care of you while I'm gone." "Nora is going to Grandma's house to get my baby sister," Bear told Mrs. Duck. "Yes, I know," said Mrs. Duck. "Your baby sister is very lucky to have a big brother like you." "I'm going to take good care of her," said Bear. All afternoon, Bear practiced being a big brother. He rocked his doll in the rocking chair. He gave her a bath in the sink. He poured milk into his old baby bottle and fed it to her. He patted her on the back to make her burp. Finally, Nora came home. She carried the new baby right into Bear's room. Bear stared. Mrs. Duck stared too. Nobody said anything for a minute. Then Mrs. Duck said, "Oh my," and Nora said, "Bear, this is Roly Poly, your baby sister." "She's not a baby," cried Bear. "She's almost as big as Mrs. Duck, and she's not brown like me." "Babies come in all colors and sizes," said Nora. "Oh," said Bear. "Can I hold her?" "Sit in the rocking chair," said Nora, and she rested Roly Poly in his lap. "She's a very heavy baby," Bear gasped. Roly Poly opened her eyes and looked at Bear. "Hello," said Bear. "I'm your big brother." Roly Poly opened her mouth and began to cry. Nora lifted the baby off Bear's lap and rocked her. "She doesn't like me," Bear said. "She's going to love you," said Nora. "Everything is new and strange to her right now," Mrs. Duck said. "Come on, let's make her bed." So Bear helped make Roly Poly's bed, then he poured milk into her bottle, and Mrs. Duck heated it up. "I have to go home now," said Mrs. Duck. She gave the bottle to Nora. "Will you be all right?" "I have Bear to help me," said Nora. "Can I feed Roly Poly?" Bear asked. "Of course," said Nora. Nora held the enormous baby in her lap, and Bear stood on a chair. He put the bottle in the baby's mouth. Roly Poly sucked and sucked. When the milk was all gone, she stared at Bear. He stared back. "You have soft fur," he said. Roly Poly closed her eyes and began to cry. "She needs to be burped," Nora yelled above the noise. She propped Roly Poly up on her shoulder. Bear stood on a stool and patted the baby on the back. "I think you'll have to pat a little harder," cried Nora. So Bear pounded Roly Poly between the shoulder blades. Suddenly, a great big noisy burp came rolling up out of her stomach. Roly Poly stopped crying. "Good job," said Nora. "I'm tired," said Bear as he climbed down from the stool. "Babies are hard work." "They certainly are," said Nora. A few days later, Mrs. Duck came to babysit while Nora went to the store. As soon as Nora left, Roly Poly started to cry. Mrs. Duck picked her up and carried her around, but Roly Poly would not stop crying. Mrs. Duck tried to feed her, but she wasn't hungry. Mrs. Duck tried to burp her, but she didn't need to be burped. Roly Poly just went right on crying. Bear climbed into his rocking chair and looked at his books. "Babies aren't much fun," he said. "They cry a lot." "Maybe you could sing to her," said Mrs. Duck. "I don't think so," Bear said. "She doesn't like me." "Please try, Bear," said Mrs. Duck. So Bear opened his mouth and sang a song about 3 beers in the bath tube. He sang very lewdly. Roly Poly stopped crying for a moment. She looked around the room. "I think it's working, Bear," Mrs. Duck whispered. "Come over here so she can see you." Bear stood right in front of Roly Poly and sang his song again. Roly Poly smiled a big smile, and she began to squirm. "She wants you to hold her," said Mrs. Duck. "She's too heavy," Bear said. "She squishes me, but I can sit beside her." Mrs. Duck propped Roly Poly up next to him. Bear tickled Roly Poly on the tummy, and his baby sister laughed. Bear told Roly Poly a story, and she listened. "Now what?" said Mrs. Duck. "She doesn't look very sleepy." "Let's give her a bath," said Bear. So Bear and Mrs. Duck lifted Roly Poly into the bathtub. Then they climbed in too. Roly Poly let Mrs. Duck hold her, but she wanted Bear to push the toy boat to her, and she wanted Bear to dry her off with the towel, and she wanted Bear to tuck her into bed and sing her to sleep. Suddenly the front door banged open and Nora came into the room. "I'm home," Nora said. "Shh," said Bear. "How did you get her to sleep?" Nora whispered. "Bear did," said Mrs. Duck. "Roly Poly's lucky to have an older brother like you," said Nora. Bear smiled. "I want to be near her when she wakes up." He pushed his bed next to Roly Poly's. He leaned over and gave his baby sister a tiny kiss. "Good night," he whispered. Then he climbed into bed and closed his eyes. The end.